Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Michael Huemer. He's a professor of philosophy at the University of Colorado. He writes about epistemology, ethics, metaethics, metaphysics, political philosophy, and is the author of several books like Skepticism and the Veil of Perception, Ethical Intuitionism, The Problem of Political Authority, Approaching Infinity, Paradox Lost, and dialogues on ethical vegetarianism. So, Dr. Huemer, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so today I wanted to talk to you about ethics and particularly ethical intuitionism, and also later on in the interview about veganism or ethical vegetarianism. So let's start with ethics more generally. Could you please tell us what the concepts of objective and subjective mean in ethics?
Yeah, objective means something like independent of the observers, or more specifically, not constitutively dependent on the attitudes of observers towards the thing that you're talking about. So when they say goodness is objective, that means it doesn't depend upon people's attitudes towards the thing that's said to be good. Like the thing is good whether or not people like it, or whether or not people desire it, etc. And subjective is, something that is dependent on the attitudes of the observers. Right. So like a paradigm example is funniness is supposed to be subjective, right? Like that's a, very plausible example. So for a joke to be funny, it has to be that it amuses people or is disposed to amuse people or something in normal conditions or something like that. Okay, so that's dependent on the observer's reaction. Squareness is objective. For an object to be square does not depend upon, how people react to it.
But I mean, in the case of ethics and morality, isn't it the case that it depends, I mean, what it's considered to be good and bad, right and wrong, or wrong depends on the valuations of people? I mean, these are not independent of the existence of people that evaluate things in specific ways. So wouldn't that mean that it's subjective?
The way you started that out was what is considered good depends on the attitudes of observers, but that's not the question, right? The question is whether what is good is dependent on the attitudes of observers. See, what is considered anything depends upon people's attitudes, because considering something is an attitude. Okay, but is the actual rightness or wrongness of an action dependent on people's attitudes? No. Right, so I think torturing babies is wrong. What if people change their attitudes about torturing babies? Like, what if most of society likes torturing babies? Is it still wrong? Yes, right, it's still wrong. So it looks like it does not depend on the attitudes of the observers.
Okay, but then there's another question. How do we determine that something's right or wrong?
How do we determine it? It depends on what the thing is. If it's like, torturing babies, you think about it and you immediately see that it's wrong, right? I think about baby torture, I can just see that that's wrong. Right, if it's something, so like that's completely uncontroversial. So like, it's not hard. Like, what if it's a difficult question? Oh, well, then, you should probably like look at the moral philosophy literature or something and, read the arguments that people have given. Like if you want to know whether abortion is wrong or not, okay, then you have to like read the moral philosophy literature about abortion, right? Because there are arguments for and against that.
Right, okay, but even if we have the arguments from, in the case of abortion, pro-life people and pro-choice people, for example, just to put those two camps on the table, I mean, I imagine that there are several steps through which we have to go, that the answers to each of them would be arbitrary. So, for example, let's say that we have to determine at what point a particular form of life really becomes live. So let's say, does life start at conception? Does it start at a particular point in fetal development? Does it start after birth? I mean, even if we look into the science of it, determining that at a specific point life starts or not, it seems to me to be a sort of arbitrary. I mean, it could be one way or the other, and then even if we agree on that, then there's another question that is, so life starts at this particular point. Why is it good or bad to end a life at that particular point, before or after that? Or more generally, why is it good or bad to end a particular life? And so, I mean, do you understand what I'm saying here? Basically,
Yeah.
I imagine that there are several steps we can follow, and each of them, I mean, the answer that we give to each of them would be, at least to some extent, arbitrary.
So, I mean, first, like the question about abortion, the debate about abortion is not about when life begins, even though that's what almost everyone in popular discourse says. But that's not what the debate is about, because nobody thinks that fetuses aren't alive, right? That's retarded. I mean, it's obviously alive. Like, look at talk to a biologist and ask them if that's like a inanimate matter or living. Anyway, okay. But there is a question of when it becomes a person, right? So being alive doesn't make it a person. There are lots of living things that aren't people. Okay, so that's the question. Anyway, how would we determine whether it's a person or not? Well, it's kind of hard, right? So there are arguments about that. And then you're asking something like, well, do all those arguments start from some arbitrary premise? No, not unless you think like almost everything is arbitrary, right? I mean, it's not like the philosophers who give arguments about this just like pick some completely random statement and assert that and then start deducing things from it, right? Like they're not totally irrational. When you read the arguments in moral philosophy, normally, and if you're a normal person, you see their point, right? They will start from some premise, but like most normal people will see the plausibility of the premise, right? Okay, now if you just totally don't see the plausibility of the premise, then nothing you can do. Okay. Now, also, does this mean that the issue has been resolved? No, it doesn't, because there are competing considerations, right? Like, this is why there's a debate. There are competing reasons on both sides. None of the reasons, like, they're not arbitrary. Like, all the reasons have some force. It's just that they're balanced by other reasons, and you can have a disagreement about which is, what are the strongest reasons, right? But, that happens in all of philosophy and, like, much of life. So, this is not a weird thing about ethics. This is just a thing about life.
Yeah, I'm not saying at all that it's a weird thing about ethics. I was just questioning if, the point that you made about philosophers presenting different reasons and then debating them and deciding which of them has more weight or not and which of them are stronger or not. Couldn't it still be the case that then the only way we have to determine if something in the realm of ethics is good or bad is the result of debating and convincing people that it's good or bad?
I don't know. Is that analytically true? The only thing we can do is debate and try to convince people of what's good or bad. That's true. Right. But, look, so this is an example. We maybe don't want to, focus completely on abortion, but I'm going to give this example anyway. The famous violinist thought experiment. Okay, it's somebody has against your will, attached your body to that of a famous violinist, and you've been hooked up to him so that your kidneys can filter his blood or something. Okay. And he has some disease where he has to have the blood filtered through your kidneys in order to survive. But after 9 months, he'll be cured. So then you can detach yourself and he'll live. But if you detach yourself prematurely, then he'll die. Okay, so the question is, are you morally obligated to stay attached to the violinist? And then most people just have the intuitive reaction that no, you do not have to stay attached to the violinist. And by the way, including conservatives, right? People of both liberal and conservative views, most people think you would not have to stay attached to him. Right. And by the way, especially libertarians, right, would say, no way do you have to do that for that violinist that you don't even know, right? Okay, so, and then that's supposed to be analogous to staying attached to the fetus, right? So, there's an intuition at the core of this, but what makes this not pointless is that the majority of people will see that intuition even if they didn't already agree with you about abortion. And then most people can also see how that's analogous to abortion, right?
Right. But I mean, in this case, then morality would be based on people's intuitions.
Yes. Yeah. There's no way of getting around that, right? That is, the moral conclusions that people draw are based upon their intuitions. And, what's the problem with that?
Okay, so, but then another question, where do those intuitions come from?
Just thinking about the question, right? So, you understand the concepts of rights and, moral obligation, whatever. And so you understand those things, and then you understand the scenario, and you think about the scenario, and you just see that, for example, you have rights over your body. You will intuitively see that. That will be obvious to you, right? So let me give you examples of other intuitions that are not in ethics, right? So if A is inside B and B is inside C, then A is inside C. So that's true, okay? No object is completely green and also completely blue. Okay, also obvious, right? Okay, so, and then, a bunch of things in mathematics, like the shortest path between any 2 points is a straight line. Okay, when you think about that, so those things just become obvious to you when you think about them. So those are what philosophers call intuitions, right? Something that just seems to you to be correct when you think about it, like when you reflect intellectually. People don't have that much of a problem with those things. So there are philosophical questions about, what's going on, but there's not much doubt that you know those things, right? And so, if that's the case, then, try also just thinking about an ethical question and see whether you have an intuitive reaction like that. And frequently you do.
Right, but isn't it also the case when it comes to moral intuitions? For example, just to give an example, we have the work coming from Jonathan Haidt and colleagues where they talk about, for example, the differences in moral foundations between liberals, conservatives, libertarians, and so on. Wouldn't that be one of the reasons why the fact that they differ in terms of the moral foundations, why they would have different intuitions when responding to different ethical questions or reacting to different responses to ethical questions?
Yes. So, yeah, liberals and conservatives will have different ethical reactions to some degree. Of course, they have different political reactions, although, it's mostly because of irrationality. Most people's political views are just not really rationally related to the rest of their belief system, and they're not really trying to be rational. Okay, but note that as Haidt says, everybody has all 5 of the foundations,
Right.
right? So like it's not that radical of a difference. What it is a difference in emphasis, right? Like liberals will tend to emphasize the harm and fairness foundations. And conservatives are more sort of like more even across all five of the foundations. Right. So, okay. So there could be differences that you can't resolve because of that, and because of other reasons. But again, that's just kind of like the way life is. So, too bad.
But then, for example, when I asked you where these intuitions come from, taking into account that sort of psychological, sociological work, they would come from basically our evolution, right? The way people evolved, because I mean, this has to do with the fact that we were exposed to certain selective pressures during our evolutionary history, and that's why we evolved these different, as Jonathan Haidt calls them, taste buds for ethics.
Yeah. I'm not sure what Haidt's view is about metaethics. I'm not sure if he's a realist or not. Um, okay, but I mean, let's see. Um, do we have intuitions because of evolution? So, in a trivial sense, yes. And so compare the question. So I have the intuition that nothing can be completely green and also completely blue at the same time. Did I get that from evolution? So in a trivial sense, yes, because human beings were produced by evolution, by natural selection, and our mind and our brain was produced by evolution. So in that sense, yes. But is there a gene that specifically selects for that belief? No, I don't think so. Like that, right? That's way too specific. There is a gene that makes you capable of just like seeing obvious necessary truths, or well, I don't know if there's a gene about that, but anyway, there was selection pressure for you to be intelligent, which makes you able to see things like that. Okay, so then, similarly, was there a gene that made me think that harm is bad and care is good, right? Because that's like the foundation, the moral foundation that liberals emphasize more. Only in the sense that our genes made us, capable of understanding moral concepts, right? And given that, the reason why most people think that harm is bad is that it's bad. Right. And like, what's the best explanation for why you think that a thing can't be completely red and completely blue at the same time? Well, that's true. That's why you think that. Right. And so, that's what I think about ethical truths. Right. The main reason why we think most of the kind of like obvious, simple ethical truths is just because they're true.
Right. Okay, but I don't know if this is simplifying the question or not, but for example, talking about colors, we evolved to perceive a certain array of colors like red and blue, and that's why we don't perceive them both at the same time, and we are able to distinguish between them. Couldn't it be the case that something like that happened when it comes to moral or ethical intuitions, and so that's why we have these specific moral foundations, for example, and if we were to be exposed to other kinds of selective pressures, whatever they might have been, we would have evolved other moral foundations, and so we would think about ethical questions in a different way. I mean, I'm not sure if this is too much of a stretch or not.
Yeah, I mean, imagine somebody hypothesizing that if we were subject to different selective pressures, then we would think that things can be completely red and completely blue at the same time. I think I've changed the colors a couple of times. Anyway, so, okay, yeah, we would have thought things could be red and blue at the same time. I mean, I have no idea what that's supposed to be like, right? Like,
Right.
what does an object look like if it looks completely red and completely blue? Like, that doesn't make sense. Okay. So like, I'm highly skeptical that there could have been selective pressures that would have made us think that. Maybe there could have been selective pressures that would have made us insane or irrational or something. So like maybe then we could have thought those things. And that's kind of what I think about some of the ethical truths, right? So like that's what I think about the idea that harm could be good, right? Like, could there have been selective pressures that made us think that harm was good? Well, only if they made us crazy or irrational or something. Okay. However, I do think there are some ethical beliefs that are more closely tied to selective pressures.
Okay.
Right? And these are typically things that have to do with reproduction in an obvious way. So like people think that like they have special obligations to their kin, like their family members, especially their children, that they don't have to anyone else. Why is that? And when you think about it, that's kind of weird. Like being genetically related to somebody makes it so that you have to help them more than people you're not genetically related to. That's weird. Why is that? And then there's just like this totally obvious evolutionary explanation. When you think about it just intellectually, it's weird. But when you think in terms of evolution, it seems kind of like obvious why that would be there. Okay, but then what you realize is that, maybe that belief is wrong, right? Maybe you're not really obligated to the people who are genetically related to you or whatever. Although I guess that's not exactly what the intuition is anyway, that they're genetically related to you because whatever, in our evolutionary past, people didn't know that there were such things as genes, so but they're in your family.
Yeah, right. So that wouldn't be an intuition, of course. That's something, that's a subconscious computation that our brain does, and we don't really have conscious access to it. But could you give us then an example of an ethical intuition that people have, and perhaps try to explain to us what's an intuition? Does it necessarily have to be something that's rational or something that people think about, or could it be something subconscious?
Well, can there be a subconscious intuition? Like I think an intuition is a kind of experience. Could there be, which I guess has to be conscious? Could there be subconscious causes of it? Yes. Other examples of intuitions. Pain is bad. Pleasure is good. You shouldn't, or maybe better. Pain is, other things being equal, a harm, and enjoyment is a benefit. Also, you shouldn't cause harms for no good reason, and it's good to cause benefits. Okay. If A is better than B and B is better than C, then A is better than C. Like very common ethical intuition there. Okay, so there are a bunch of examples like that. If you can produce a benefit for someone without making anybody worse off, then that's typically a good thing to do.
Right.
Many of these are sort of ceteris paribus, like, unless you have a reason otherwise, right? Like produce the benefit unless there's a reason not to, and don't produce harms unless there's some pretty good reason to do it. But yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to ask you, so ethical intuitionism, is it something that stands in contrast with ethical theories, like, for example, deontology, consequentialism, virtue ethics, or is that something that could be, could have some sort of relationship with them?
So it's not in conflict with those. So,
Okay.
You want to distinguish ordinary ethical theories from metaethical theories. So intuitionism tells you something about the nature of ethics and what we're doing when we say things are right or wrong and things like that. It doesn't tell you directly what is right or wrong. That's the job of ethical theory. There have been, deontological intuitionists and at least some consequentialist intuitionists. So Henry Sidgwick was a utilitarian intuitionist, famously. And then you have deontologists like W.D. Ross. So G.E. Moore was a consequentialist, but not a utilitarian. So, and I don't know. I assume there's some virtue ethicist who is an intuitionist, probably, right? And so, and in any of these cases, the philosopher would try to base their ethical theory on, their intuitions, which is not so hard to do because, like, there is some intuitive force behind all of the major ethical theories, right? Like, there's a reason why it seems plausible to people.
Mm-hmm. And in that sense, would you say that, for example, of course, we can have people who are consequential intuitionists, deontological intuitionists, and so on, but do you think that it could be plausible for people to apply different ethical perspectives to different ethical questions and still be plausible or logic? I mean, so for example, evaluate one question through a consequentialist lens, another question through a deontological lens, and so on.
So I guess yes. I mean, so the way they're standardly defined, consequentialism and deontology are incompatible by definition.
Right.
Because deontological ethics just means non-consequentialist ethics. Okay, but deontologists are, most of them, I should say, are not completely insane. So they don't think that, the consequences of your action don't matter at all. Like, nobody thinks that except insane people like Immanuel Kant. Okay, so like a deontologist will sometimes be doing, quote, consequentialist reasoning. That is, he'll be taking account of the consequences, and sometimes that will be decisive to what ought to be done. Like, if there's an action where nobody's rights are at stake, then you can decide that based upon the consequences, right? Right. So, like, in that sense, yes, you can apply deontological and consequentialist approaches to different questions. Although the consequentialist would deny this, right? Because the consequentialists are extremists. That is, they think only consequences matter. There's never like a side constraint or whatever.
Right. So, and what is your position on moral nihilism? Do you think, I mean, I would assume that you are not fond of moral nihilism. What do you think are some of the biggest issues with it?
I mean, there's only one major issue with it, right? Which is, being completely insane, right? Now, so that's a technical term there. So let me explain. Like, the nihilist just has like a maximally implausible view about ethics, right? That is, okay. So, like, there are some arguments for nihilism, and they'll give arguments that are something like this. So, like, this is inspired by Mackey. If they were to be objective values, then they would have to be things such that they automatically motivate you to act regardless of your desires. Okay, that's first premise. Second premise, nothing motivates action independent of desires. So, conclusion, there can't be any objective values. Okay, and then there's another premise. When people make moral statements, they are making assertions about objective values. So, conclusion, all moral statements are false, right? They're like, so, murder is wrong is a claim that there's an objective wrongness property or something that applies to murder, and there aren't any objective wrongness properties, so murder isn't wrong. Okay, so now what I say about this is, well, so like the premises of this argument are not like completely crazy. Like, there's some plausibility to those premises, but they're way less plausible than the denial of the conclusion, right? Like, the conclusion, it's not the case that murder is wrong. Like, that's so implausible. That's way more implausible than denying one of the premises of that argument, right? And like, the premises of that argument are nowhere near certain enough to justify me in taking such a completely radical conclusion, right? And so, like, if you think this, like, okay, so I have no reason not to go out and like torture some babies. Like, no reason not to do that. Like, that would be perfectly, right? That would be just as good, which is to say it would have no goodness or badness whatsoever because nothing does. Just as good as if I were to go out and like, donate money to charity to save 10 lives. That's just as good as murdering 10 babies. Right? Like, that's so absurd that, you would just, in order to justify that, you would have to have some premises that are just completely obviously true and undeniable. And they don't, right? Like in that example that I gave, like the premises are not obvious at all, right? There are things that, that anti-realists frequently say that sort of seem vaguely plausible, at least to them, right? But they're definitely not obvious. So, like, it's not obvious that for there to be an objective value, it has to automatically motivate action independent of desires, right? Like, in fact, I don't think that I've ever seen anyone other than anti-realists say that. Right? Like that, I don't think that that's part of like normal moral discourse. I don't think like that's part of the views of moral realists. They automatically, right? Maybe some moral realists, right? But like that's nowhere near to being universally accepted, even among people who believe in objective values, right? So like their view about what objective values would be is like highly questionable. Wait, that's not the only argument that they have, but all of them are kind of like that, right? The premises are like vaguely plausible at most, not completely obvious as they ought to be, right?
Mm-hmm. So, since you mentioned desire, I'm going to quote you now. This comes from your book, Ethical Intuitionism, just for you to explain this quote here. Rational moral judgments weigh self-interest among other factors, just as rational prudential judgments weigh present inclination among other factors. Consequently, morality takes precedence over prudence, and prudence takes precedence over current desire. So, could you explain this relationship between morality, prudence, and current desire?
Yeah, I mean, so if you want to do something right now, that gives you a reason for doing it. That's the reason for doing it. It will satisfy a desire. Okay, but sometimes you have to overrule your current desires for the sake of the long-term good. Like when you feel like partying at night, but you have a test tomorrow, so you have to study instead. So you're like, I don't want to study, but I have to do it anyway. Okay, so like I give that example because I assume that it's relatable to my students. Okay, and then why is that? So it's rational to go ahead and study anyway, even though you don't want to do it right now. So like you're not following your currently strongest desire. Why is that rational? Well, because like the prudential judgment already takes into account the strength of the current desire. So like what happens is you judge how good it's going to be to satisfy this current desire, and then you compare that to how good it's going to be to satisfy your desire that you're going to have tomorrow to be doing well on the test. And then you sort of like when you weigh these desires against each other, you see that the desire to do well on the test is more important, and so you judge that that's what you should study for the test now, even though you still don't want that right now. Okay, so I claim there's something similar with morality, and its relation to prudence. When you make a moral judgment, a properly made moral judgment should take into account your self-interest, right? So like I'm not an ethical egoist. I don't think it should only take into account your self-interest, but it should take into account the self-interest among other things. Okay, so, and then you see this if you think about some, just think about some examples. So there's the famous example where there's like a child drowning in a pond, and you can wade into the pond and save the child, and that will cause you to get your clothes wet, and then you'll like miss your philosophy lecture or something. Okay, so when you think about that, you're like, yeah, drowning is way worse than missing your philosophy lecture and getting your clothes wet. So when you think about it, you're like, yeah, I think I have to pull the child out. Okay, but that would not be the case if you had stronger interests at stake, right? So imagine the example is a little bit different, and it's like a dangerous river, and you don't know how to swim. Okay, so you could go into the river, and there's some significant chance that you drown, but also a good chance that you succeed and save the child. Now, do you have to jump into the river and save the child? No, right? And this is not just my assertion, right? Like, I think that that's the intuitive reaction of most people. And notice that that's a moral judgment, right? That's not just a prudential judgment. Like, I'm not just saying, oh, it's not in your interest. I'm saying, like, are you morally required? No. And like, you would make the same judgment about other people. Like, you saw somebody else who could have saved the drowning child and they didn't do it. And they explained that, well, there was a significant risk of drowning because they don't know how to swim. And then you would judge about that other person, oh, well, I guess that's permissible then, right? You didn't have to jump in. Okay, so what that shows is that, like, normal moral judgments, if you're doing it properly, already take into account how important your interest is, right? And so, like, that's why the moral judgment gives you what you ought to do, all things considered, right? So, like, you shouldn't then weigh the moral judgment against your self-interest, because the moral judgment already considered your self-interest.
Mm-hmm. So I've asked you about moral nihilism. What do you think about moral relativism? Because I think that's not an anti-realist position, right?
So I classify that as an anti-realist position.
Oh,
so
also, okay.
Yeah. So, like, realist views hold that there are objective values, something like that. And anti-realist views think there aren't any, right? So there are three versions of anti-realism. If you don't think there are objective values, you could think, value judgments are always false. It's a nihilist position. Or B, they're neither true nor false. This is the non-cognitivist position. Or C, okay, they're sometimes true, but they depend upon the attitudes of observers. Right? The truth of a moral judgment depends on observers' attitudes. So that's the subjectivist and or relativist position.
Okay.
And, you know, what I think about that, false, right? So, you know, I suggested earlier in this discussion, you can just consider examples like, well, what if there's a society that approves of torturing babies? Okay, so true or false? If you live in such a society, you should torture babies. I think that's false, right? You shouldn't torture babies even if your society approves of it, right? Still wrong. So, you know, looks like it's not relative, right? Like, the relativist view would be, you know, basically right and wrong depends on the attitudes of society. Like, something's right if society approves of it, right? But seems false. Right? And of course, there are, like, many examples in history that you give, right? So if you live in Nazi Germany, so true or false, if you lived in Nazi Germany, you should help them round up the Jews to send them to concentration camps. So that's false, right? If you watch the movie Schindler's List, you know, where Oskar Schindler was trying to save Jews and did save, I don't know, I guess maybe hundreds, maybe thousands of Jews. Anyway, he saved a bunch of Jews who were working in his factory from being sent to the concentration camps, and as a result saved their lives. People didn't know at that time what was going to happen at the end, but at the end, you know, like millions were killed, right? So he saved a bunch of his workers' lives by keeping them out of the concentration camps. Okay, but he was going against the norms of his society, right? So if you watch Oskar Schindler, do you think he was the hero or the villain of that movie? Right? He was the hero of the movie, right? He's not a villain. Right, but like, that's what the relativist view would imply, right? Because they say, oh, right and wrong is determined by the norms of your society. So he was going against the norms of his society, so he was a bad guy, right? Well, that's crazy, right? Like, that's the most crazy moral error that any moral theory could make.
Okay, so perhaps let me just explore an example. Of course, this will probably not change your overall view of moral relativism, but let's say, for example, let's talk about infanticide. So it's considered wrong in our modern industrialized societies, but talking about more small-scale hunter-gatherer societies where in certain situations, particularly from an evolutionary perspective, there might be a rationale for killing children in particular circumstances. Like, for example, if a woman bears too many children and then there's not enough resources to sustain all of them, perhaps it would be better for the woman to, on those conditions, to sacrifice one or two, whatever the number might be, of their of her children for the rest to survive, and if she didn't do that, then, I mean, assuming that's the case, that all the children would die. So would that be a case of moral relativism or not?
No. So yeah, you might think, oh, so if you ask somebody in our society, hey, is it okay to kill your kids? Almost everyone will say no. And then if you ask, you go to that society and then you ask, hey, is it okay to kill one of these kids? And they go, yeah, that's what we have to do. So there's a moral difference between our two societies. I mean, if you put it like that, it sounds like it. But if you ask the person in our society, if you filled them in on the details of the actual situation, like I think a large number of people would say, oh, well, then that's permissible, right? Because that's what you have to do, right? And in fact, I think so. Like that doesn't happen in our society because we have lots of food, all right? But there are cases that are kind of analogous to that. So like people could be in an emergency situation where somebody has to be sacrificed. Okay, so here's a story. Like there's a bunch of people who are on a life raft, and actually the life raft is about to sink because there's too many people on it. So what can you do? And so you have to throw somebody overboard. Right? And then you can have a debate about like how you choose the person to throw overboard, whatever. Like maybe you draw a lot, or like maybe you throw the heaviest person, or whatever. But anyway, like somebody's got to be thrown overboard. Okay, and if you ask people out of context, is it okay to throw somebody off a life raft, causing them to drown? They would say no. But if you fill in the details, and it's like, well, otherwise they're all going to drown, then I think almost everyone would say yes, right? Like that's what you have to do. I don't think that really shows a difference in values fundamentally between our society and other societies. Right? And I'm not saying that there aren't differences in values. There are, but I don't think that that's like really an example of it.
Well, I mean, and perhaps even in this case, I don't know, perhaps if you asked people that were part of those more small-scale hunter-gatherer societies if it's right or wrong to kill children, just that question straight away, probably they would also say no, I would imagine, and perhaps would say yes, according to those specific circumstances I described.
Yeah, like, it's not like people in other societies didn't value their children. Like, you're not going to find a society in which they just wanted to kill their kids for the heck of it, right? Just harming them for no reason. That wouldn't happen. So I think that you could come up with cases that are like better illustrations of having different values. So okay. Something like, well, can you kill the kid because it's severely disabled? Right. So like I think they did do that in ancient Roman society. Severely disabled. So it's not a threat to everybody else, but it's just going to be like using up resources, and it's going to have not such a great life because it's disabled. Right. And so what I heard is that in ancient Rome, they would kill that kid. And then today we think that that's horrible. So like that does look like a difference in values. And, a bunch of other differences in values. Right. They were also like forcing people to fight to the death, right, for entertainment of other people. So I guess they thought that was cool and funny. Right. So funny to see the people like struggling for their lives and getting limbs chopped off and so on. Okay. So actually they had different values in those respects. But so what? So that just shows that they were wrong. That's the way it looks to me. Like it shows that people in ancient Rome were primitive, more primitive than us today.
Okay, so do you think that moral questions can be studied and answered by science?
Well, sort of yes, sort of no, right? Like, so science can contribute something. It can't do the whole thing, let's say, right? So, I know this is a thing that Sam Harris says, that, like, we can use science to find out the moral truth. So, yes, you can do that if you make a bunch of moral assumptions. So, like, if you assume utilitarianism is true, then you can scientifically investigate what causes happiness, like in, like psychology. And then you can do like social science studies also to figure out what, the effects on, the effects of different policies on social conditions and thus indirectly on people's happiness and so on. So yes, but then science is not going to tell you whether utilitarianism is true. Right, like this is such an obvious thing that I can't believe Sam Harris hasn't thought of it. Although maybe he has, and right, because I haven't listened to everything he has to say. Maybe he has an answer to that. But so obviously, like, yeah, you can do empirical investigation to find out whether X causes happiness. You can't do empirical investigation to find out whether happiness is good or bad. You just have to understand that intellectually. You just have to like understand what happiness is and like intuitively see that it's good.
Yeah, it's interesting because since you mentioned Sam Harris, I don't think he considered the philosophical side of things that well, because even in a note in his book, The Moral Landscape, he says basically that things like, or words like consequentialism, deontology, intuitionism, blah, 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 I mean, that they just bore himself. So, I mean, he basically makes the assumption that if through neuroscience we are able to understand what are the sort of things that produce pleasure and produce pain, that from that we can derive, I mean, what's good and what's bad without any sort of philosophical theory in between, let's say.
Yeah, it's not such a good sign if you're writing a book about ethics and you're bored by like the main terminology used in ethics, right? Like, that's bad. Anyway, yeah. So, yeah, I mean, it just sounds like, oh, well, he's assuming utilitarianism or something like that, which is it's a common ethical view, right? But it's not like, it's not self-evident, so like it has to be defended, and the defense is not going to be just appealing to neuroscience, right? So some people are going to say, well, like there could be stuff that causes pleasure and happiness and whatever, and is still bad, right? Like, okay, so what if there's some person who like really loves watching child pornography, right? It's like super fun for him. Okay, we only have to exploit like a few children in order to produce videos that will give pleasure to all the pedophiles in the world, and there's like lots of pedophiles, right? So it's going to produce more pleasure. So is that what we should do? And okay, let's go talk to the neuroscientists, and like just what are the neuroscientists going to tell us? Like they're going to confirm that it really is causing pleasure for the pedophiles. So like, okay, that doesn't really resolve the moral question, right?
Right. And do you think that what do you think about the so-called is-ought gap? Of course, perhaps this also has something to do with, for example, the position espoused by Sam Harris, but do you think that it's in any way possible to derive moral values directly from facts or scientific facts?
Yes and no. Yes, if you're allowed to have intuitions, and no, if you're not, right? Right. So like you can think about the scientifically established descriptive facts, and then you can have an intuition that something is right, wrong, good, or bad. If you don't accept intuition, then no, you can't do anything. If you don't accept moral intuition, then you can't get to values just from descriptive facts, right? I.e., there's no form of inference that's accepted in other contexts that's valid or cogent that gets you from purely descriptive premises to an evaluative conclusion, right? So like you could make up a new form of inference, and where you say, okay, like X caused pain without producing any other benefit or whatever, therefore X is bad, and you could say, oh, that's a valid form of inference, right? Okay, but that doesn't follow any recognized pattern of inference, that works outside of ethics, right? Like that's not like if you go and take a formal logic class, like that inference will not be in there, right? So like you would have to make up inferences that are specifically ethical inferences, right? And then how would you know that those are valid inferences or cogent inferences? And then, well, it would just have to be like you have an ethical intuition.
Yeah, yeah, I understand. So let's now talk about veganism then. Do you have a set of criteria that you follow to determine that a particular species is worthy of moral consideration?
Well, I mean, I guess the criterion is, oh, it's worthy of moral consideration if it has interests or something like that. But I think, well, basically, I think it has to be capable of pleasure or pain, enjoyment or suffering. Why? Because, well, I think if you're incapable of enjoyment or suffering, then it's like there's nothing that I can do to you that's really bad, right? Um, then I was thinking if there are any exceptions to this. Uh, yeah, I don't think there are any real world exceptions. There might be hypothetical exceptions. I don't think there are any real world exceptions where you have interest despite being not capable of enjoyment or suffering. Now, if you ask, okay, well, how do I know if something is capable of enjoyment or suffering? Okay, that's often hard to tell. But I think like a requirement is that you have a brain. Because as far as we know, experiences are caused by activity in your brain. So like plants don't have experiences because they don't have a brain. Right, that would be my inference. Also, like clams and oysters don't have a brain, so I infer that they don't have experiences and they don't have enjoyment or suffering. So, you know, do whatever you want to the clam, right?
But we would go about that through through behavioral analysis and comparative neuroscience to determine if, for example, even when it comes to the species who have brains, I mean, to determine that they suffer or they experience pain or pleasure, we would go about it through comparative neuroscience.
I guess that and sort of behavioral study. Right. So, I mean, so having a brain is only a necessary condition. I take it to be necessary for having enjoyment or suffering. So, or as I say, sentience. It's necessary for sentience, but it's not sufficient. So you could have a brain and conceivably still not be sentient. How would we determine? Well, so that there is actually literature on this, right, where people try to figure out whether insects are sentient or things like this. So one thing is looking at behavior. And another thing is just looking at physiology. So like, does it have the kind of nerve endings in it that the stimulation of which causes pain in you? Nociceptors, as they say. Mm-hmm. If it doesn't, then you infer it probably is incapable of pain. Right, and then the behavioral study is something like, well, if it's experiencing something where you would be in pain if that happened to you, will it behave in a way that's similar to how you and like the other higher animals behave, right? So like if the insect's leg is damaged, will it limp, like you would, or try to protect the limb from getting contacted by other things? And in fact, the answer to that is no. Like insects will just like rest the same weight on an injured leg. Like they'll walk just as if it wasn't injured. Or if there's a severe injury, will that prevent it from doing other things? So like if the lower half of your body was completely smashed, you would not carry on with your day. You would not carry on with whatever else you were doing. Like you wouldn't just keep eating your cereal or whatever. But there are cases where insects will do that. Like lower half of the body is just completely smashed and then it keeps eating or keeps mating or whatever is going on, right? Whatever it was doing. Right, so that suggests not having pain.
But do you think that there's some sort of, let's call it, moral scale in the animal kingdom? So, for example, let's say that some animals are capable of experiencing pain, but then there we get into the social animals and they also have more complex emotions, more complex social lives, social relationships. Do you think that those would be criteria that would add moral worth to animals, to the social animals in that case, in comparison to the more simpler animals, or are those criteria that, I mean, are not that relevant for you, and the way we should treat one set of animals versus the other would be the same?
Oh yeah, so yeah, I mean your first question was about the criterion for moral consideration, and then I
Right.
cited sentience. So that's just a necessary condition. Well, I guess it's necessary and sufficient. But that doesn't mean that that's the only morally relevant condition, right? It's just the condition for deserving some moral consideration. So, like, I think there are other things that matter, although I wouldn't say having social relationships is relevant to your moral status. So, if there's
Okay.
like some hermit who's living out in the woods totally by himself, he doesn't have any social relationships, I would not say that he has fewer rights than the rest of us. But I would say that there are characteristics of human beings that kind of make our lives more sophisticated and of greater value. So, like a typical human life is more valuable than a typical non-human animal life, right? And that's well, it's largely because of our intelligence, and because of our intelligence, we're capable of more valuable kinds of activities that other creatures are not capable of. So the other creatures are never going to understand the world in the way that an intelligent human can understand it. So they're not going to be able to like pursue whatever philosophical understanding, which, as we all know, is super important. But also, like, yeah, they won't be able to have kinds of like impressive achievements, right? And there's just like so many things that depend upon having a certain level of intelligence, right? So like the animal is not going to be able to plan to be the world's greatest at something, right? Or like, do a really great thing for the world. Like, that's not going to happen.
But if those are also criteria, what about humans who, for example, suffer some form of brain damage and are not able to have those sorts of experiences, or to appreciate certain things that are part of normal human life?
Yeah. Yeah, so you could have severely mentally disabled humans who have capacities similar to non-human animals, right? And so then I would say, well, then they have a moral status that's similar to the non-human animals, right? Which means, well, you still shouldn't abuse them, like you shouldn't abuse the animals either. Um, but they don't have all the same rights that the rest of us have, right? So like if you can either kill a mentally disabled person or kill a non-disabled person, right? Well, you have to kill the disabled person, which is so like you're driving a car and you have to run over one of them. These are horrific examples, but anyway, yeah, I guess you run over the mentally disabled person as you would if it was a non-human animal, right?
Do you think that, from a philosophical perspective, we should consider that other species, particularly, for example, the great apes, also have morality? Because if you talk with primatologists like Franz de Waal, for example, I mean, the way they talk about the sort of social relationships that they establish with one another, how they behave toward one another, and so on, it seems that they have some form of morality, but does it make sense to talk about morality in non-human animals from a philosophical perspective?
So it makes sense. Whether it's correct or not is open to debate, right? So like I mean, some of the things that look like morality might be kind of enlightened self-interest. Okay, so like kind of reciprocal altruism behavior, like one animal does a benefit for the second one does a benefit for the first. That might just be enlightened self-interest, so to speak, and it pursued instinctively. Okay, but I mean, I think there are things that look like morality where it's an animal helping another animal that couldn't be expected to help it back. So you occasionally see things like this. So like you can find videos on YouTube of stuff like this, like A bunch of animals save another animal. Okay, so like there was one video where there's a child wildebeest that is being attacked by alligators in a pond or something, and then these hippos come over and actually save the wildebeest. Like they come over and chase the alligator away, and then the wildebeest gets out. And it's like, wow, what's going on here? Like there's no explanation other than that they were trying to help that other animal. And the other animal is not like this, like baby wildebeest is not going to help out the hippos, right? So, it's not self-interest. So it looks like they had some, kind of like basic moral understanding, right?
Mm-hmm. But I mean, in that sense, we have to be careful about anthropomorphism, right? Because sometimes we could be projecting some of our mental experiences in terms of morality, for example, and how we think about moral questions to other animals. But I mean, even if other animals do not think in moral terms as we do, does that really matter when it comes to animal rights and animal ethics?
Yeah. So, I mean, to your first point, it is easy to anthropomorphize, right? It's easy to mistakenly assume the animal is thinking or feeling what you would be feeling, which usually it isn't, right? Usually it's thinking something more basic. But I gave that example because it's hard to think of another interpretation of what they're doing, other than trying to be helpful. Okay, but anyway, like this stuff is not happening all the time. Like that's a remarkable video because that doesn't usually happen. Okay, so most of the time, other animals do not appear to be behaving morally, right? Although just to be clear, most of the time humans are not behaving so great either. So anyway, okay, so does that affect their moral status? I don't know. I mean, so they're not behaving morally doesn't mean that you can behave immorally towards them, right? Like I'm sure of that. All right, so like I know that newborn babies don't have a sense of morality. That does not mean that I can torture them, right? Like that doesn't mean that, all bets are off, like I have no moral obligations to them. So some severely mentally retarded people might not have an understanding of morality, so that doesn't mean that I can torture them. I'm pretty sure that psychopaths have no understanding of morality. Okay, and that does mean that we should hold them captive somewhere, right? Like in a prison or a mental institution or whatever. But that does not mean that, we have no obligations. Like we could just do whatever we want, right? Like, you can't just torture the psychopaths for fun because you don't like them, because they don't have a sense of morality.
Yeah. I mean, there's those human examples, but I asked you that question specifically because there are people, particularly when it comes to the question of animal rights, if animals should have rights or not, that they object by saying that we shouldn't extend rights to beings that do not have obligations and are not able to understand morality.
Yeah, good. So, I mean, many people say this as if this was like a super compelling, obvious argument, right? But I don't find that obvious at all. So, okay, so you've got this newborn baby. It doesn't have any obligations, right? So does that mean it has no rights? Okay, so I take it that not having rights doesn't mean all bets are off. Like it doesn't mean that you can kill it for fun, but it would mean sort of like the deontological logic doesn't apply, right? So it would mean that you can kill it if you can save like a larger number, right? Or you can inflict a harm on the one in order to produce a slightly larger benefit for someone else. So do we think that? So like that's not obvious to me. Like so I don't think that's an absurd position, but I don't think it's obvious either, right? And like I don't think that they're not having obligations is like that doesn't seem like a decisive consideration. So the baby doesn't have obligations, so therefore we can sacrifice one baby to save two babies. Like I'm not sure that's true at all. That doesn't seem so compelling. And so if that's not compelling, it's not compelling in the case of non-human animals either.
Right, but I mean, even if we extend our moral circle, let's call it that, to include other sentient beings. Does that entail directly or, yes, directly that we should grant them rights? Because that's more of a, let's say, legal concept, right?
I mean, there is a legal concept of legal rights, but there's also a purely moral philosophy concept of moral rights, right, which are distinct from the legal rights. If we give moral consideration to animals, it does not follow that we have to grant them rights. Doesn't follow that they have rights or that we should think that they have rights. But do they have rights? Hard to say, because we don't actually know why people have rights, right? Like, there are theories about why people have rights, but none of them is so compelling, right? And like, if you have a theory about why people have rights, you should not be totally convinced of that theory, right? Because what you should realize is that there are lots of smart moral philosophers who disagree with it. They have an incompatible theory. Some people think that people don't even have rights at all. And then, so because we don't really know why people have rights, assuming they do, we also don't know whether that extends to non-human animals. I think, though, that, I mean, whatever you say about non-human animals should be the same as what you say about newborn babies, because they're very similar, right? They have, like, actually, adult animals are typically smarter than human babies. So, like most arguments that you could give, hold on a second. Most arguments that you could give about how the non-human animals are different would also apply to the newborn babies, right? And also mentally disabled people, right? So, like, whatever you say about one, you should say about the other, but it's not clear what you should say about either, right? Like, I think that's not obvious. If you think that they might have rights, then you should probably, like, err on the side of caution by not doing the things that would be rights violations.
Right. But I mean, even if there's all those questions surrounding rights, human rights, animal rights, and so on, there should still be, because of the ethical considerations we've been talking about concerning other animals, there should still be legislation to protect them.
Yes. Well, yeah, is that like a justified use of legislation? I would say yes. I mean, you have to think about, like, okay, like, well, what should the legislation be? So I feel fine about laws against animal cruelty, right? Which we have, but they're not that strong, right? So, like, okay, if you seriously abuse your pet, then you could get in trouble for that, although you won't get in all that much trouble. Like, not like if you had abused a person, okay? But if you, horrifically abuse your livestock animal, like, if you do the same thing that would have gotten you thrown in jail briefly if you did it to a dog, but you do it to a pig instead, then, oh, that's fine. Like, that's completely legal because, they torture pigs all the time because it's accepted practice. Right. So, like, I would extend the law so that you can't do this stuff to the livestock, that, like, you can't do things to them that would be considered torture if you did them to a human being. Like, there should be such a law. Should there be a law that you can't eat meat at all? Well, not in this society, because that would just not work, right? Like, in the way that the drug laws don't work, and they actually make things worse. Right. Like, so if you try to make a law against something that virtually everyone is doing, that usually doesn't work and, like, actually backfires, like, makes things worse. Right. But I think that if there were more sort of animal welfare laws about, like, not torturing the animals on the farm and treating them humanely, I don't think that would backfire, because, like, I think most people would be okay with that. Like, most people would agree with those laws.
But even if you think that it shouldn't be illegal for people to eat meat, do you think that because of the kinds of suffering animals are put through in the meat industry, for example, do you think that that should be illegal?
Wait, sorry. Do I think what should be illegal?
The meat industry.
The whole
Because of the kinds of suffering animals are put through there.
So we should try to eliminate it eventually, right? I think the first step would be to have laws that require humane treatment. So that would make it illegal to do what they're currently doing, but it wouldn't make the entire industry illegal. They would have to change their practices to be more humane. Like, I think that would be the first step to make. I think the ultimate goal at the end should be, to replace the whole animal agriculture industry. But I don't think that's feasible right now. I don't think we should attempt to do that right now, but I think we should attempt to eventually do that. Right? What's actually going to happen is we're going to replace it with cultured meat, right? Lab-grown meat that doesn't require an actual animal. I think that will actually happen because, ultimately it's going to be cheaper and better, right, and more efficient, right? And so I think that at a future point at which we have that on the market and it's commercially viable and it's a better alternative, it's going to push out most of the meat consumption. And after that happens, I think most of the quote real meat consumption will push out most of the animal agriculture. And after that happens, then I think it'll be feasible for the government to ban the rest, right, that's remaining. Because what's going to happen is there are going to be some people who are like, well, I just feel like I want to eat an animal. Even though the lab-grown meat is chemically identical, even though it's the same material, some people are going to be like, yeah, but it didn't come from killing an animal. I really want the thing that is just like this, except it came from killing an animal. There are going to be a few people who are like that because they're completely amoral. But I assume that it won't be most people, right? So then at that point, I think it would be okay to ban the rest of the industry, right? To eliminate the small amount of people who are still killing animals for no good reason.
Do you think that there could be any compelling arguments against eating lab-grown meat? Because, for example, I'm not sure if this is something that you find among mainstream philosophers or not, but I've heard people saying that, for example, it could be problematic to eat lab-grown meat because, people could still acquire the taste of meat and that could compel them to try to consume the real meat. I don't know. It sounds like a sort of purist argument where people say that we should simply not eat meat at all, regardless of if any animal is suffering or not. But what do you think about it?
You mean the lab-grown meat could be like a gateway?
Yeah, a gateway drug to the...
Yeah, that seems false, right? So, first of all, almost everyone is already eating the animal-made meat. So, the worry that we're going to cause people to start doing that doesn't make much sense, right? It's the other way, right? Also, it's probably going to be better, right? Better in what way? Well, whatever consumers want. It's probably going to be better because if you can grow it in a lab, then you can sort of control its characteristics. So it's probably going to be cheaper eventually. Right now, it's more expensive, but it's going to be cheaper eventually because in principle, you're using a lot less energy. In principle, there's less resources going into it because in traditional agriculture, you make the entire animal and then you cut off the meat and then throw away the other parts, right? So in principle, you're wasting a bunch of stuff. And, there's the time that it takes to make this. With the lab-grown meat, you only make the part that you want. So, it's more efficient in principle, which means eventually, when we perfect the technology, it's going to be cheaper. Also, they're probably going to optimize it for whatever consumers want. So, they could have meat products that are especially low in saturated fat for people who care about that. And then for other people who don't care about that, they could have meat that has extra fat. Because it will be more tasty or something, right? So it'll probably be better designed for consumers' tastes in addition to being cheaper, right? So there's no reason why after trying that, then you would go to the inferior product, right? So now you might think about are there other reasons? You might think, so there are health reasons why people become vegetarian. So that could possibly be a reason why you still shouldn't eat the lab-grown meat. But I wouldn't force people. Like if people don't care about their health and they just care about the taste, then then they can do that, right?
And those health-related reasons that people might have to become vegetarian or vegan, those are not moral reasons, right?
I don't think so, right? I mean, it would be self-interested reasons. So, I mean, I take it that that typically doesn't count. Like this, the self-interested reason by itself doesn't generate a moral obligation. Um, yeah. So, I mean, I think the nutritional situation is, most meat contains saturated fat, which is not so healthy for your heart. Like most meat products are not so good for the heart, although they might have other nutrients that are hard to get. So the optimal diet for health reasons is probably not a vegan diet, right? Because there are some nutrients that you'll be missing. Okay, but also the optimal diet is not eat meat all the time, right? The optimal diet is probably actually eating fish, right? And, it's like limited animal products, but also mostly eating fruits and vegetables.
Well, by the way, do you think that there's any problem with consuming animal-derived products, like, for example, milk and eggs?
Well, I mean, I think it's basically the same problem, right? So if you care about animal welfare, if you care about how the animals are treated, then it's the same problem, right? Because the animals on the dairy farms are treated in pretty much the same way, which is like with complete disregard, right? So like they're just like being abused all the time. Similarly for eggs, like the chickens, the laying hens are just like stuffed into the tiny cages. They get deep beaked, whatever. They just get treated with complete disregard, like all the other animals, right? They have a somewhat longer life, I guess, because they're being kept around to provide the eggs or the milk in the case of the milk products. But still not so great, right?
And by the way, on that point of them having a longer life, do you think that there are any good arguments in favor of the of animal agriculture that would resemble that argument of, for example, there are usually the species, or I think all of them, the species that we use as animal sources of food products have been artificially selected, and so some people argue that they wouldn't even exist in the first place if we didn't have the meat industry, and if we were to abolish it, then because they are not adapted to any sort of natural environment, they would go extinct. Do you think that there's something that's something that we should take into account?
So all of these animals came from wild species, and then they were bred by people for whatever characteristics we wanted. So if you released all of the livestock animals, I assume most of them would not survive very long. The wild counterparts, like whatever animals they came from, I presume are still around. But anyway, think about the logic of it. So if you create creatures, then you get to do whatever you want to them. Like, is that right? Because they wouldn't have existed if it wasn't for you, right? So like in some sense, okay, so the specific individual animals definitely wouldn't have existed if not for the meat industry, because they were just like those individuals were created by the meat industry people. With that, and then you could say, well, that type of animal also wouldn't have existed. Depends upon how finely you individuate the type, right? Like there's some, okay, like I think there are some wild cows, or at least there used to be. So anyway, but that's really not particularly relevant, right? So here's the story. Like imagine that we were breeding some people to be slaves, which, by the way, people did in the United States, right? Like, they first started importing slaves from Africa, but then there's like sometime in the 1800s when they banned importation of slaves, and then, the slave traders started breeding slaves from the existing population of slaves in America. And then, so after that, you have a bunch of slaves where you could say, oh, these people wouldn't have existed if it weren't for the slave trade. So does it follow from this that the slave trade is fine and that like we could do whatever we want? Like it's fine to enslave these people because they wouldn't have existed if it weren't for the slave trade. So I assume we reject that, right? That's not right. So like that seems analogous to, oh, these animals wouldn't exist if it weren't for the meat industry, so it's fine to do whatever we want.
Right. Do you think that meat eaters should be held morally responsible for their consumer choices?
Yes. So, I mean, people are responsible for their own decisions, right? Like, you have free will. You can decide not to do it. There are lots of people who decided not to eat animal products anymore. So, you could do it. So how could you not be responsible for it, right? I mean, I think some people are like, well, somebody else is actually doing the torturing and killing. So I guess people feel like they're not responsible because somebody else is directly doing it, right? But, like if you're patronizing somebody who's doing horrific wrongs for you, right? They're doing these wrong things to provide products for you, and you're paying them for it. Like, I don't think you can say that you're not responsible, right? This is sort of like, when the mafia boss orders a hit, and then later he says, well, I didn't pull the trigger. So, like, why are you blaming me? I didn't kill anyone, right? It's like, no, you are still responsible.
Okay, so since we evolved eating meat and all sorts of animal products, do you think that it runs against people's intuitions to talk about animal ethics in any way?
I mean, to some extent, like I think when you first mention animal rights or animal welfare or whatever, like there are many people who have an immediate negative reaction. And then many people sort of refuse to consider it, and they just try to dismiss the whole thing and not think about it. Okay, so like in that sense, there's a intuitive resistance. Although like I'm a little reluctant to describe it this way because I think it might just be a self-interest resistance. Like, right, like when people dismiss a moral position that if they were to accept it would require them to sacrifice their interests. Like, I'm not sure whether they're having a genuine ethical intuition or they're just sort of trying to protect their self-interest. But be that as it may, like you can certainly give arguments that appeal to normal intuitions, right? So like most people can see the point when you ask them, okay, so like why is it okay to torture members of other species? So like you agree that it's not okay to torture you. Why is it okay to torture a creature that belongs to another species from you? And like most people can see the point of that question, they can see that that requires an answer. And then most people will give some answer. And then it will be some like obviously ridiculous answer, right? Which will be easily refuted, which can also be seen, right? So like they will say, well, it's because I'm smart and the other species are stupid. And they go, okay, so suppose that you met a stupid person. Is it okay to torture them? Because you just said the reason it was okay to torture the animals was that they're stupid. So if you meet a stupid person, it's okay to torture that person, right? Okay, and then almost everyone will see the point of that too. Like they will have the immediate intuitive reaction that no, it's not okay to torture someone just because they're stupid, right? And then and basically the same thing goes for everything else that they say about like why it's okay to torture the animals, right? So, you can appeal to intuitions that are not specific to vegans, like intuitions that almost everyone will have.
Right. So aside from the nutritional issues that we've already mentioned here that vegans might have if they adopt, of course, in this case, a strict vegetarian diet, do you think that veganism has any sort of major moral flaws?
No. I'm trying to think of what the moral flaws would be. Yeah. Did you have anything in mind specifically there, or?
No, I mean I personally agree with veganism, so I was just wondering if you thought there could be some.
Yeah, I mean, like you could imagine hypotheticals in which that would be the case, right? Which would be some terrible result that would happen from being vegan. But there aren't any that I think are actual.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps the only big one that comes to mind was the one we've already talked about. Like, for example, abolishing the meat industry would potentially lead to the extinction of the animals used there. I mean, that's the only one that comes to my mind. I don't know.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Like, so, one thing that people have said is, well, like the animals, like it's better to have a short, crappy life than not to exist at all. Now, that's really not obvious at all. Right? So, um, like we create all these billions of animals every year, and like on average, they live for 3 months, right? That is surprisingly short, okay? But that's because the vast majority of them are chickens. And yeah, that's how long, and they pump them full of growth hormones and whatever to grow them really fast because it costs money to have the chickens there, right? So they have like a 3 month life of being stuffed in a tiny cage or, just stuffed into a barn with a whole bunch of other chickens, sitting in their own excrement, breathing ammonia fumes because, they pour ammonia all over the floor because that's cheaper than cleaning up the shit that's on the floor. Right, so they're like sitting in their own shit, and then they have to breathe the ammonia fumes because they poured that on the floor instead of cleaning it out. Okay, so that's your life, all right. And like you get your beak cut off or the end of the beak cut off to prevent you from pecking the other chickens, and there are nerve endings in the beak, so it probably feels about like having your nose chopped off. Okay, so that happens one time, and then you're there for 3 months stuffed in with the other chickens. And then they cut your throat in order to eat you. Okay, so like that's the life of the vast majority of livestock animals. So is that better than not being born? I'm not sure that's better than not being born at all. Okay, but anyway, so imagine that we were talking about people and somebody said, hey, I've got a plan. We can vastly increase the human population of the world. What we could do is so we can make there be 10 times as many people. Now, the catch is that all of these people are going to have miserable lives such as I just described. They're going to be like living in a tiny cage like this. So like they won't be able to move, and they will live for 3 months. And, like one time in their life, somebody will chop off a body part without anesthetic, and they'll be sitting in their own excrement for those 3 months. And then at the end, somebody will like bash their head in. Okay, and now, you can push a button that will create 90 billion of these lives. Okay, or just leave it alone and there could just be like, people having normal lives, but a lot fewer of them. Should you push the button to create the 90 billion people who live for 3 months and that have that miserable life? So I think most people will not do that, right? Most people do not think that that's a great thing. So, I don't think that we should do that with the animals, right?
Right. And since we're talking about or questioning if it's better to not exist at all or to have a shitty short life in this case, I would like to ask you, do you have any specific position on anti-natalism? I'm asking you that because I've had David Benatar on the show and he also extends his anti-natalist ethics to other animals.
Yeah. My disagreement with David Benatar is I think that positive experiences are good and can outweigh negative experiences. So I think that the suffering that, your offspring are going to have, so everybody has some suffering in their lives, I think that counts as a reason against having them. But I also think that the positive experiences count as a reason in favor of having them and that they can outweigh, for most people, the positive experiences outweigh the negative experiences. So I think it's okay to create them. Okay, there's a rights-based argument where you say, well, you haven't gotten their consent. Right? You have to get the consent of the baby before you have the baby, and you can't do that, right? So you can't do it. But I think like the vast majority of people will retroactively consent. There's a vast majority of people after they're born will be glad that they're born, and if asked, they will say, yes, I don't mind that you had me, right? Because, most of them will have lives that are worth living. So, I think that makes it okay.
And do you think that it would it would compel you in any way to, I mean, to accept more the arguments of anti-natalists if we take into consideration the fact that there are many people in the world that suffer in many different ways. I mean, just if we talk about suicide rates and rates of depression and so on, it's a huge number of people. Do you think that it would make a good argument to not procreate due to precautionary reasons?
Oh, well, yeah, so there are some people whose lives apparently are, there's more suffering than enjoyment, right? I say apparently because, like, some people kill themselves, so you could infer that they had more suffering than enjoyment in their lives. But like that's a really small minority of the total, right? So wait, I used to know the statistics. How many suicides are there per year? I
think it's 800,000 across the globe per year.
On the world. Okay, yeah. And how many deaths are there per year, right? I don't know. Is it something like 50 million? It's some.
I'm not sure of that number.
Okay. Anyway, so many times more. So, in other words, most people don't kill themselves. It's only a tiny minority. Okay, so like I agree that there are some people whose lives are not worth living, like they're a negative utility. But it looks like the vast majority of lives are positive utilities. So, I mean, it looks like it's okay to create a life, right? Of course, this could be modified by your circumstances. If you're in particular circumstances where it looks like you're especially likely to have a miserable child, maybe then you shouldn't procreate, right? But if it looks like you're going to have you're in good enough circumstances that you will very probably have a happy child, right, who will not cause lots of harm to other people, like that could also be relevant, then it's okay to have the child, right?
So, for example, if you live in poverty and probably your child's future prospects will not be that good, would that be an example?
Yeah, it seems like at least that's a consideration, right? I mean, even most people living in poverty, I think they would say their lives were worth living. I think they would say, they're glad that they were born, whatever. But, you might think like, you're like a 13-year-old homeless person, right? Should you have a child? Then I would go like, no, probably not, right?
Yeah. Okay, so let's just go back to veganism for a little bit and to end the interview, just 2 or 3 more questions. Do you think that carnivores are a problem? Because, I mean, I was about to ask you if you think they are immoral, but maybe that question doesn't make sense applied to other animals. But do you think that from a human moral perspective, carnivores are an issue?
Yeah, I mean, you mean non-human carnivores, right?
Yeah, sure.
Human carnivores are a problem. Yeah, I mean, they're amoral, right? Because they're unable to understand morality. The amount of suffering in the natural world is a problem, right? Like there's just this vast amount of suffering in the natural world. So, if you had a way of ending that, then and it didn't involve killing everyone, then you should end it, right? Or doing something similarly horrible, right? Unfortunately, we don't have a way of ending it, right? So, I mean, if you could cause there not to be any carnivores and it wouldn't destroy the ecology, then I think you should do that.
Okay, so if we were to learn that, for example, if by any means we could render carnivores, I mean, they could not procreate anymore and it wouldn't have any sort of major impact in their ecosystems, do you think that could be something to consider morally?
Yes, yeah. I mean, if there was a feasible way of doing that, like I think, of course you should do that, right? But of course, in the real world, eliminating the carnivores from the food chain is just going to disrupt the ecology, right? It's going to cause, other crazy things to happen, or so I assume, right? So like in the real world, this isn't feasible. Plus, like we don't just like we don't even know how to do it in the first place, right? Okay,
Yeah.
but you can imagine a hypothetical where that would be the thing to do, right? So, I try to think why somebody would not agree with this. Like, suffering is bad, right? Like, if you could cause there to be a huge amount less suffering, and we stipulate that there wouldn't be any big negative consequences, then obviously you should do it. The only thing I can think is people would think, oh, maybe there's intrinsic value in nature and the existing species or whatever.
Right.
So, yeah, I just don't think that really. So I think there's value in individual organisms. But I don't think there's a value in just maintaining the status quo in nature. Right. And by the way, nature is constantly changing, species become extinct naturally. Is that intrinsically bad? And if you don't think so, then it's not clear why it's bad if it's caused by human beings. Because a species can cause another species to go extinct in nature, right?
Right.
Why aren't we just like that? We're species that evolved naturally. Why don't you think of us as part of nature? And then we did something that caused a species to go extinct. Right. Okay. Now I do believe in the value of the individual life. So we shouldn't cause harm to individual animals unnecessarily, right?
Right. Okay. So, in that sense, for example, at what point would it be immoral for animals to drive, for humans, to drive other animals to extinction? Because even during our evolutionary history, when we were only still hunter-gatherer societies, we drove megafauna in several different continents to extinction. So, would that already be something immoral we were doing back then?
I think it involved harm to the individual animals, so that could be immoral, right? Although at that time the people might have been merely amoral because they might have not had moral understanding. Yeah. So, there could be something immoral about it because of the harm to the individual animals. If it didn't harm any individual animals, then no, right? But obviously, they're killing the animals, so that would be harming those individuals. But if they just if they persuaded, persuaded the woolly mammoths not to reproduce, and then there weren't any woolly mammoths after that, then you're okay, but assume there's the same total amount of life, right? So there are other organisms, they're just not woolly mammoths. Yeah, then I don't see what the problem is.
Yeah, perhaps what I was thinking about was that because back then we were using rudimentary technology to hunt the animals down, and now we have things like the meat industry, which is basically animal farming on a large scale, that perhaps there would be degrees of immorality here. I don't know.
Right, yeah. Yeah, clearly the hunting is a lot less bad, right? The way that the animal dies after primitive people hunt it is comparable to the way it was going to die if the people hadn't hunted it, because it would have been most of them would have been killed by another predator.
Right.
But it doesn't ruin their entire life. Right? It doesn't the primitive people didn't force them to live in tiny cages, in sitting in their own excrement, and cause them to only have a 3-month long life. Right? They didn't do that. So they were nowhere near as bad as we are today.
Yeah. So, okay, so now is perhaps the most controversial question of the entire interview. So, does veganism have anything to say about cannibalism? So, for example, let's imagine that someone dies of natural causes. Is it immoral for another person to consume their body?
So it depends upon the circumstances, right? So, I don't know, did the person consent to being eaten before their death? I guess they own their body, so they could say what happens to their body, their diet, just like they have a will to dispose of their material goods. So, Okay, so if they consented to being eaten, then yeah, it's permissible. Um, that seems fine. Other people might get upset about this, but I guess I think the other people don't really have a right over it. So it's only the person who actually died who had a right over his body.
But I would imagine then that sense of property over one's own body, would it also apply to other animals? For example, if someone found a dead animal on the woods, would it be morally wrong to eat it?
No. So did the animal consent? Well, I don't really think that they have the same rights. So I'm not sure that animals have property rights, right? And so, okay, does it have rights? Does it have a right to decide what's done with its own body? I don't know, but like a right to decide what it's done with its own body after it dies, like, yeah, I guess I just don't think that. Um, why not? Maybe partly because I think the animal doesn't have preferences about that. Like, I think people have super strong preferences about their body after they die, but I think like a wild animal doesn't have any preferences about that. So, like I don't really see what the problem would be. I don't see who the victim is in taking the dead body. Okay,
Yeah.
also, actually, by the way, if you don't take the dead body, like, okay, so like there's a deer that died of natural causes. If you don't take it, it's gonna be eaten by other animals. So, like even if the deer really didn't want to be eaten by anyone after it dies, its preferences are not going to be satisfied either way.
Yeah. Okay, so just one last question then. Now talking more on pragmatic terms, do you think that if we all went vegan, that would be in any way a problem for the environment? Because, of course, these are complicated questions, but do you think that um, it would be feasible to produce enough plant-based food sources for humans, for all humans, to obtain the nutrients that we need to obtain from them? Or do you think that, for example, the plants we produce for animals to consume, animals who are part of the meat industry, do you think that that would be enough for other people to eat?
Yeah, I mean, so when you think about it, this should be obvious, right? When they raise animals, they have to feed the animals. They raise animals for human consumption. They have to feed the animals, and the amount of food they have to feed the animals is larger than the amount of food they're going to get out of it, right? And like that has to be true because of like conservation of energy, because most of the animal is not being eaten, like right, because you don't eat the bones and you don't eat the brain and whatever these other organs and such that people don't want. So so the amount of food that's going in, like the amount of calories that are going into the animal, has to be greater than the amount of calories that people are going to get when they slaughter the animal, right? So if we stopped raising animals for food and we just raised plants with the same amount of resources, you could produce more calories, right? So I mean, like, a lot of people converting to a vegan diet would make food more available, right? It would lower food prices. It would lower their prices for vegetable foods. And then, it would be easier for people in poor countries to afford enough food and so on. So, that's an added benefit.
Yeah. Okay, so let's end the interview there. Just before we go, Dr. Huemer, would you like to tell people where they can find your work on the internet?
Well, yeah, like you go to my website, owl232.net. So, the word owl, OWL, followed by the number 232.net. And then, there you'll find a link to my blog, which is fake news, fakenews.net. And nous is spelled N-O-U-S, like the Greek word for mind or something. I've got 8 books now, which you can find on Amazon. So.
Okay, great. So it's been a real pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for coming on the show.
Yep, it's been fun. Thanks for having me.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this episode until the end. The channel depends on your support to keep running, and so I would like to ask you to please pay a visit to my Patreon page and consider making a pledge there. Any amount, even just $1, would already be a great help. You also have links to PayPal in the description box of the interview and otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litska and Blanchett Pereira Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Ernst Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wissel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arnaud Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Forrest Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Vos, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colomba, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Mikkel Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omer E. Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Ian Solon, Roman Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londoño Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Elman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmidis, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino. My producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Staffini, Kian Gilligan, Sergio Quadriano, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, and Niruban Balachandran, and my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, and Matthew Lavender. Thank you for all.